My name is Erica Rossetti, and I'm the Urban Waters Coordinator at the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary. I will be moderating today's webinar and managing the Q&A, along with my colleague, Roberto Fragoni, who is from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Before we get started, I'd just like to go over a couple housekeeping things for this webinar this afternoon. So first, you'll notice that all participants are automatically muted and your video will be turned off while joining the webinar. So you should only be able to see the presenters and the moderators' videos during the webinar today. If you have any questions during or after the presentations, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A feature on Zoom. Should be in the bottom bar on your screen. Roberto and I will be moderating the Q&A, and we'll have time at the end of all the presentations to address some of the questions. The chat is also open for networking purposes, allowing any of the attendees to make connections with other people that are in the room today. However, we do ask if you have questions, so please do put them in that Q&A feature. And finally, as I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded in case you'd like to view it later. So before I get into introductions, I'm going to start a poll and just leave it open for the next couple of minutes so that attendees can fill that out, and so our speakers have a good sense of who's in the room today by geography and by sector. So you should be able to see that there, and I'll leave that open for a minute or two. Great. So alongside the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, this webinar series today is being brought to you as part of the Urban Waters Federal Partnership. Urban Waters is an EPA environmental justice program in partnership with many other federal agencies and nonprofits and the various partners that they all work with. It also offers many resources, including networking and funding. The main goals of the overall partnership are to reconnect urban communities, specifically those that are economically and historically distressed, with their waterways. And we would like to accomplish this not only through better federal coordination, but also by working and really collaborating with community-led revitalization efforts. Urban Waters also has 20 ambassadors at designated locations throughout the country, one of which includes the Delaware River location, which is where I'm located and where we're bringing this webinar to you today. And you can see that we're one of the locations on this map here. So in our Delaware River location in particular, we're focusing on this lower and highly urbanized section of the Delaware River and the surrounding urban areas and its tributaries. So you can see that on this map here, we have 4 cities in question that include Camden, New Jersey, Chester and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Wilmington, Delaware. And as you can see, just from these population sizes, we do have a diverse sizing and diverse structures in each of these cities. However, many of the issues that we face in our urban areas in this location cities and in cities throughout the country are experiencing very similar issues, things like flooding or erosion, which is worsened by climate change and which also worsens people's economic and housing situations, loss of habitat and affordable housing as development increases, lack of public access to waterways, distressed economies and health conditions, as well as long histories of pollution and environmental injustice. So the reason we have decided to host this webinar series this month is to kind of take note of the intersections of these issues in our urban areas. It's not just about habitat or water. It's not just about housing and health. It's not just about flooding and climate change. It is the interconnection of all of these things and how we plan to deal with them equitably. So with that being said, I'm very excited and enthusiastic that we have some fantastic speakers today who are experts on how these issues that I mentioned are actually intersecting on the ground and who have experience understanding how all of them connect while working directly within some of these communities. So first we'll have Gloria McNair present all the way from Jacksonville, Florida. Then I'll turn it over to Arthur Johnson from the Center for Sustainable Engagement and Development in New Orleans. And then finally, we'll close out today hearing from Jimmy Gastner from the Federal Reserve Bank, who has some research and community engagement expertise on many of these issues a little closer to home in the greater Philadelphia, Delaware River watershed area. So I am going to stop sharing my screen before turning it over to Gloria. And then let me also end this poll and see our results. So it looks like we have a really good mix here with us today in the room. Mostly nonprofit folks, but a good representation from federal and local governments, some educators and community members, and then 85% tuning in from the Delaware River location, but some folks in the Southeast, Northeast, and other Mid-Atlantic states today. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us again, and I'm very excited to turn it over to Gloria. Gloria is the manager of community engagement and equity initiatives for Groundwork Jacksonville in Florida. So I'll turn it over to you, Gloria, and in the meantime, I will also share your slides.
Thank you, Erica. I know my title does not exactly flow off of the tongue, but you did a great job. So good afternoon to everyone. I am with Groundwork Jacksonville, and our big goal here in Jacksonville is building the Emerald Trail. And it is going to be, once completed, is 30 miles of new and existing trail, and as a major undertaking, a 10-year project that we're 3 years in, and so 7 years to go, fingers crossed, and we're making great progress. So next slide. So Groundwork Jacksonville was chartered in 2014 by the then Mayor Brown, who saw that there was a lot of contamination of the waterways of the creeks here in Jacksonville, and there was a dream about the emerald necklace at that time, and he brought Groundwork in to address some of these issues. We're one of 21 Groundwork trusts. Our key partners, of course, are the City of Jacksonville, Groundwork USA, which includes the National Park Service, and the United States EPA. So next. So our mission and purpose is to transform Jacksonville's urban core through creek restoration, trail building, community building, and through leadership, stewardship, and workforce development. Next slide. Okay, this is just a diagram for you to see what the Emerald Trail will look like. It's 9 sections here, and this is, as you can see, a major undertaking, but it will connect the urban core, and that is what is so important about this project. And you will see how it ties into all of the elements that Erica already discussed. So next, please. So the trail benefits, when we started doing community engagement and speaking with our partners, one of the things we wanted to emphasize were some of the benefits of having a trail, such as recreation, which of course is the first thing that people think of, but health and well-being, economic development, mobility, neighborhood revitalization, and social connectivity. And next. And this is one of the major things when we talk about building the trail, we had some complications there. We have two creeks that have experienced a lot of contamination over the years, industrial contamination, biological, just everything that could be imagined, from a slaughterhouse contaminant to mineral deposits. The first one that was already on the city's docket for restoration was the McCoy's Creek. And so we took that on as our first major project in 2018. And this is just how the creek is, how it's situated in downtown area, how it flows all the way out to our St. Johns River, and then there are branches of it. So a little bit of background for you. So North Riverside, this is just a demonstration of some of the, the typical neighborhood of North Riverside, Mixon Town looks like, and it's one of the communities directly connected to McCoy's Creek. The traditional looking housing, the church design that you see there is very demonstrative of what you'll see throughout Jacksonville. And DJ's Record Shop, which is like it's been there in the community forever. I think that's DJ standing out front there. So next slide. So a little of the demographics about this community, that 78% Black, median household income around $20,000. The 48.2% living below the poverty line, 16.7% unemployment. And one of the real challenges here in the community is the high renter to owner occupancy, at that 61.9% renter. So as you can see, the tie in with everything now with the housing market and everything. So next slide. And this is our residential classification of the neighborhood. The unique thing about North Riverside is that you'll notice that some of the industry is kind of intertwined into the neighborhood, and it's called the Railroad District because of the settling that took place in this area. With around the railroads, a lot of the Blacks settled in Jacksonville along this urban core area for job markets. And the businesses have remained, and they're within walking distance of the community, but that does not equate to employment by those agencies that are actually there within the neighborhood. So next slide. So this is a further demonstration of what the housing and the population, you see the constant decline that the neighborhood has experienced. The one thing that we did notice when we looked at what's happening currently is that the rate of people leaving the area has slowed down a bit, and that's a good thing. I don't know whether that's COVID related, people are just remaining in place or what have you, but things are changing, or at least remaining kind of stable. So next slide. So these are just photos. I want you to see some of the challenges that the residents of North Riverside and the McCoy's Creek. I'm sorry, I told my husband I was on Zoom, but I just heard him upstairs. McCoy's Creek, where the bulkhead, it was a creek that was bulkheaded, and it's that structure is failing now. You can see health department signs saying that this is a contaminated area, no fishing there, which was very important to the neighborhood. It was an important aspect of it. And next slide. This is the flooding that the residents could experience after. This is just a normal storm. This is not a hurricane condition. The flooding of the road, and it was one of the major things that we hope to accomplish with the creek restoration. Next slide. And the litter, a constant, whether it was flowing from other areas within the floodplain, but within the watershed, but a constant there with the litter. Next. And this is, I keep this slide in here because I just find it amazing. that within a 40-acre park, this is the one playground, very limiting, isn't it? And it's actually kind of what I could not demonstrate in this photo is that it's actually kind of cut off from the residents. The kids don't have an easy access to this area. So next slide. So with the restoration project, of course, we want to reduce flooding, improve the water quality, create the habitat for fish and wildlife, and create access and restore some recreation. So next slide. So our neighborhood partners, one of the key things that helped us proceed as quickly as we have through this process has been community engagement. Community leadership, stewardship training that we started, equity plan development, future workforce development, and just getting our partners in line and getting them in support of what the community needs are. Next slide. And so this is a photo from a visioning session that we had with North Riverside and actually one of the other areas, Brooklyn, that has already seen a lot of gentrification, but there is just a handful of Native residents still in the area. And so we knew that they would want to have input on how we proceeded with the restoration and the community development that flowed along with that. Next slide. One of the things that, with community engagement is learning what residents want. So we did a survey. This was done in person at community meetings, and we just got an idea of what folks were most concerned about. This is when they were first getting to know Gloria, and it was very broad, but you see up there, flooding was one of the major things that they did discuss at the time. Next slide. So once we had the visioning groups and we had done the survey, we had our design team come up with designs for the creek restoration. We had a big McCoy's Creek Festival so that people could have a look at the designs and we could get feedback and input from them. Next slide. These are just a few photos from the Creek Festival. It was wonderful having people come out. They biked out, they walked out, and it was what people had envisioned, a shared community where they could just walk out of their door and walk over to the creek and be able to enjoy it. And they were able to say what they liked, what they thought would work, what they did not think would work, and that creek restoration has already begun. So next slide, please. This is some of the activities. Like I said, we had cycling, we had a little martial arts, and the whole thing was to for residents to visualize, to actually see what they could do in their neighborhood with this restored area. Next slide. I won't go into all of this. These were just some of the things that people said that they wanted to have. They wanted community gardens. They wanted outdoor learning space, which we were very pleased, and the educators in the area were very pleased to hear, and pollinator gardens. We were just very pleased with everything that the neighborhood wanted for their neighbors and for themselves. And when we did the survey, it was some of the other things that we heard, that people were interested in leadership, in mentorship, and of course in improving the neighborhood and developing soft skills, job opportunities. They wanted to find ways to prevent the littering, to remove the litter, and they were concerned about environmental health. Next slide. So because of that, we said, what could we do at our level to help the residents achieve some of their goals? And we created CREST, which is Community Restoration Environmental Stewardship Training. And it's an intergenerational project that residents were able to learn about the environment. We took field trips where they could see other areas that had been, next slide, they could see other areas that had responded positively from restoration efforts. We had a job training component as well. And these were just some of the partners that we had. And this is a focus group that we had around CREST, because so often agencies go in and they decide that they want to do something for the community, and they never really ask the community what they want it to look like. Well, this group right here gave us some ideas on what time we should have sessions, what type of topics we should cover, and what type of incentives we should offer. They were quite invaluable. So next slide. So like I said, this says multi-generational, but I prefer the term intergenerational, because it was active engagement within the group where the adults act as mentors and learn from the teens, and the teens learn from them. So it was great. So there was classroom time, like I said, field trips, the leadership component, and we had a job training component to it as well. In the top photo, you see some of our adult CREST members who became water monitors, and they were paid to perform this task that was so important to us seeing what the contaminants, seeing what the quality of the water was prior to the restoration, so that we can compare it to the results following the restoration, to prove that creek restoration really does work. The other resident concerns, as I continued my community engagement and got to know people, they were like, you're like 1-2 years in, and they were saying, Miss Gloria, we really appreciate the flood mitigation that's going to happen, but we do have some other concerns in the neighborhood. And they were around displacement, because you could already see that people were interested in this area because they were thinking of the investment opportunities once the creek was restored, and especially around housing, people wanting to acquire property. And unemployment, the vacant, abandoned properties, and around that, these people are also located within a food desert, so the availability of fresh fruits and vegetables. Next slide. So we started an equity planning phase, where first we had to do the visioning with the residents. We had some setbacks in this. Where the residents, it was supposed to be community led, but they were a little bit shy about that. So we had to become a bit more involved in the whole visioning process than originally planned. So next slide. We got through the process. COVID came along, and it proved even more difficult. It's hard to do community engagement via Zoom, but we did it, and we had a combined effect. So next slide, please. So we did, I guess we were some of the first hybrid folks where we did Zoom and in-person type meetings here. We followed the proper safety protocols. This is in one of the local churches that I owe that pastor so much. From the visioning process, 4 priorities emerged as of most concern to the residents, and they revolved around economic opportunity, housing, history and culture, and environmental stewardship. And we could see how the nutrition, youth, and safety and all of that all were applicable to those 4 major concerns that were intertwined. Next slide. So the equity planning, over the holidays, I completed the equity plan that I worked diligently with the North Riverside residents, where those 4 concerns, where we had 4 subcommittees to work on those issues. And so we met regularly, and now we have a draft plan to move forward with. Housing is at the top concern of that plan. And so 3 kind of major things emerged from that. a home repair program that they desire for the community. Something as simple as having a new roof on a house, or maybe not so simple when you think about the cost that's involved, can add resiliency to a community, help against climate change. It just can be so invaluable. And this program that we have designed along with the assistance of LISC would include roof repairs, minor plumbing, and electrical. Affordable housing, this is where we're looking at trying to start a land bank or a CLT, even an LLC, where we can acquire property and put it in a protective fund or source for residents to ward against like developers who want to come in and take advantage of what they consider is going to be a booming neighborhood. The residents really want to maintain the character of their neighborhood. These single family homes, they don't want high rises anywhere near there. And so we want to maintain that for them. Moving those residents from renters to home ownership is very important as well. And we have a number of partners who will help with education in that respect. Some people, just getting their finances in order, preparing them for first-time ownership. So our next steps of implementing that plan, we have to have the residents review it. Another thing that we're hoping to do with helping with employment, several folks have asked us, how are you going to maintain these 30 miles of trail once they're built? Well, we're looking at Emerald Trail Stewards, where it'll be a group of folks trained by Groundwork Jacksonville's certification process, and where those people can be hired directly by the city, people from the neighborhood working with the city to maintain the trail. And I can't think of a better situation than that. And I'm rushing because I have so much to say, and I think I'm out of time, Erica, but thank you so much.
Thanks, Gloria. We will address any Q&A at the end. I think 1 or 2 questions came in there. I also just want to stress that a lot of these issues we're also seeing in our urban communities as well. So this is a fantastic case study to see how to involve the community when you're doing restoration projects, how to think about housing and climate change and all of these other issues that we mentioned equitably. So I'm going to now turn it over to our next speaker, Arthur Johnson. Arthur is the CEO of the Lower Ninth Ward Center for Sustainable Engagement and Development in New Orleans. And I will get your slides up right away, Arthur.
Okay, thank you, Erica. Guess good afternoon, everyone. Good morning if you're in the Central's time zone, as I am. It's a pleasure to be here today to discuss what we focus on is building equity through community-based leadership. And the focus is working with communities, not for communities. And I think as Gloria has mentioned in her presentation, the whole idea is looking at how do we work with communities? How do we engage with them? How do we get them involved in making decisions that will impact them, will impact their quality of life? And sometimes that's not easy because we're accustomed to kind of presenting what we're going to do, not always getting feedback from those communities or getting feedback after we've already made decisions. And what we've seen over the years is that doesn't work as well, particularly as we're talking about our issues that impact our quality of life, our environment. A lot of our watersheds, whether they're lakes and rivers, streams, things that impact our community and that are within our community that people rely on are important. Next slide. So as the Lower Ninth Ward Center for Sustainable Engagement and Development, or CSED for an acronym, we're a community-based nonprofit, and our purpose is strategically to reinforce community-driven goals through its efforts to create an economically, culturally, and environmentally sustainable community in the lower Ninth Ward and in other communities along the Gulf Coast, particularly communities of underserved and communities of color, which are many times, again, left out of the discussion as decisions are being made in their communities and that will impact their quality of life. Next slide, please. So today our presentation is a few objectives. We're going to identify some key elements which will provide a guiding philosophy for success. We're also going to determine whether these activities are with nonprofit are in a need-based context. And what we mean by that is understanding the need of that community and of those who are impacted. That's not only those who live there, but those who may work there or have an integral role in that community through different efforts. So it involves education, recreation, health. We've seen that health plays a key role in today's world with the pandemic and how significant that is in relation to quality of life and change. And those things have to be kept in mind as we're looking at making change in communities and improving and enhancing communities. And we're going to determine the effectiveness of our leadership. Leadership, and it varies. And we're talking about community leadership. We're talking about public leadership, local, state, and maybe even federal components that play a role in that community. And particularly as we're looking at established communities, as Gloria had mentioned, that are dealing with certain challenges, housing challenges, challenges of population, employment challenges. And again, let's not leave out the health challenges that are there as well. So all these have an impact on the effectiveness of the leadership and how effective that leadership does in making change and how adjustable they are as these components are coming up all the time. Next slide, please. One of the key things that's important that we used, we created some principles. And these principles are not only adaptable and significant to New Orleans, but also anywhere in this country. And as we talk about working together and working with each other, not just for that community or telling them what to do, these principles are significant. We got to respect all citizens in that community. And that community can be broader than just in the neighborhoods. It also can be in the city. It also can be in the surrounding areas. And knowing that the people that live there, the people that are engaged there, whether they live there, work there, go to school there, recreation there, is so significant. And so we have to be able to understand that and put that into perspective as we are looking at bringing about change. And that means bringing equity. That means bringing all people into this discussion. We have to restore our natural protection of the region. And this gets into the environment, but the environment on its broadest context. So it's not only our natural environment, but it's also the environments that impact that community, that make that community survive, that feed into that community. So economic development is key. It's a driving force, and that's businesses, small businesses, and understanding what those things, what the role of those entities are and how they play a role both in the past as well as in the present and hopefully in the future. Implementing a plan, process. This doesn't mean coming in with a plan. It means the process of how you're going to get that plan in place. Again, we look at the importance of working, again, with community engagement, and looking at communities on its broadest context. So many times we talk about communities and we kind of leave out sometimes the business community, the small businesses. But they play an integral role. They feed in that community. They provide the resources, the products that makes that community tick. And in some communities like the Lower Ninth, where we don't have a major grocery store or major commercialization in that community. And so people have to rely on small businesses to provide their needs. They can go out that community, but that also presents challenges on transportation and Also, a community is made up of a large number of seniors and disabled and retirees. So just getting in your car and going somewhere else is not always a viable option for that community. So those things have to be taken into place when we look about the process of planning and wanting to bring a difference. Value diversity. Again, we can't say enough about that. The equity, knows who's in your community, understand that who those people are, why are they there? Even from as new members of the community are coming into play, why is that? And how do we engage that community? How do we engage all those community members and make sure that diversity and equity is an integral part of everything that we do in bringing about this process for change and the betterment? Protecting the city of New Orleans, well, protecting that community, and we talk about embracing smart redevelopment, realizing that as we look at change, realizing that change is not easy for people to adapt to. It also, there's a dollar component that ties into that as well. So we have to take those things in place as we look at redevelopment. And honoring the past, build for the future. Well, you got to know what the past was to know where you are now in the present, and also where you're trying to go for the future. And what those changes are forthcoming, what has been the past, how sometimes the past is not always as transparent as we think it is. Or sometimes we're led to believe certain things that really is not accurate. So again, this is where your community engagement comes into play, in talking with those who have been in the community, that know the history of that community, and that doesn't know it because they read it, but because they lived it in the generations. And as we all know, a lot of things are lost in the history, particularly on the written history, in all of our community, our neighborhoods, our nation. And we know every day we're seeing things that we thought was correct that are not quite correct. Sometimes not correct at all. And so we have to honor that past. We have to honor those who bring it, and because particularly when they live that past and bringing that in, and that we have to take that and move that forward for the future. Providing for passive survivability. Sustainability, which is in the name of our organization, is key. And as I continue to live every day, I realize how important sustainability is. And many times you forget about things in the past when you've been around for a while. But then you start to try to remember, well, why was that important? How did that change? And that's both the good things and the things that are not so good. But it is understandable that survivability and sustainability are key as you move forward for building in the future, knowing what they are, trying not to make the same mistakes, and trying to understand that. So if coming into communities and you're not from that community, you have to listen, you have to be patient, and you have to find the equitable ways of how do you understand the history and that survivability, which means sometimes it's not these massive meetings that we're sometimes led to believe, these town hall meetings, because you don't always get everyone who's comfortable in that environment. You have to reach out, so you have to have variations of different ways of understanding that past. Again, fostering local owned and sustainable businesses. I talked about that earlier. It's small businesses. It's what those businesses are. They've been around a while. They've been able to exist because of things that they've been doing. They may not look like they're making a lot, but they are significant, particularly to that community. And then we have to focus on the long term. The whole idea of planning and processing is for the future, is for taking the current and moving that forward. And so that means looking at long term, and that means we have to put certain projections that we think might be in place coming from the long term to be able to make things happen. But again, we have to understand the past to be able to get to that point. Next slide, please. This is some pictures again of some of our community focus groups and working together. And as you can see in the slide, You have engagement. You can look at the picture of the people's eyes and that they're listening, that they're focused, that there's diversity. There are public officials there, there are community members there, there are faith-based members there. So it's taking all, as much of that community as you get in place and all engaging. And then you can see by the paperwork and all that there that, you know, this was not something that was taken lightly. And it wasn't that there was a group just talking to people, that people are engaged. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about working with the community. We're talking about getting them engaged, getting them to be part of not only the discussion, but part of the solution, because these solutions are going to be significant because they're going to be impacted by it. And it means we have to have voices for all. And that means as we work voices for all, that it's important that we move forward in that effort. Next slide, please. Next slide. So what we have here is again, our primary work. Our pillars of CSCD were food security, that's nutrition and health and healthy foods. It's also natural environment. Because the lower Ninth Ward was 3/4 surrounded by water. The Mississippi River is on one side, the wetlands and the bayou is on the other side, and across is the industrial canal, a government-run waterway. So we're 3/4 surrounded by water. So understanding that natural environment, the role that it plays in the community is so significant to understanding the community and the members and all of the elements that play into that. And of course, volunteer coordination. How do we work with our volunteers and with our community to make a difference on that point? So that our community education and civic engagement are important as we talk about community change. Next slide. Changing that community, engaging all people and finding different ways to do that. Here is just one of those efforts of, we had a bike tour and we had people come in and we brought them to the bayou and on the platform overlooking Bayou Bienvenue. But as they were doing that, as you can see, they're talking to each other. They don't all know each other, but they're engaging in that way. Next slide, please. It's also important that as we look at serving all people in our community in equity, that means people in Black and brown neighborhoods and people of color and people of different cultures and heritage and how they're intertwined together. These are also very significant in bringing about not only change, but making a difference for that community. And so as I wrap this up, it's just the importance of understanding in how do we work with communities and not work with them and work for them, being part of that component, so that it's not felt that they're just on the table and we're providing them, but it's how we provide that they are part of the solution that will impact them not only in the present, but also for the future and future generations. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Arthur. I think those 10 principles for doing really good, equitable redevelopment will be really helpful for a lot of our attendees on here today. Again, if you have questions for Arthur, please put them in the Q&A. I saw a couple come in. But before we finish up today, I'm going to turn it over to Jimmy Gastner, who is the Community Engagement Associate at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. Everybody didn't make it easy for me today with these long titles, but Jimmy has some experience with what our communities have been dealing with in some of these realms a little more locally. So I will turn it over to you, Jimmy.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you, Gloria and Arthur. It was just inspiring to hear about the work that you're leading in your communities. So good afternoon, everyone. As was already mentioned, my name is Jimmy Gastner, and I'm a Community Engagement Associate with the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. And I'd like to start by thanking Erica and Roberto, the Partnership for the Delaware Estuary, and the Urban Water Partners for hosting today's webinar. This is a critical time for today's important discussion And it is great that so many community leaders from such a wide variety of sectors are participating in this session. Before I dive into today's discussion, though, I do need to start with a disclaimer. The views I express today are my own and do not necessarily represent the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia or the Federal Reserve System. So with that out of the way, I really want to use my time today to address two elephants in the room, building on what our other speakers have already discussed. First, as you already may be wondering about, I want to discuss why the Philadelphia Fed seeks to address challenges faced by vulnerable renters and homeowners. Second, because I know there are participants from so many sectors joining today's conversation, I want to explain why you should care about this too. Whether you're a housing policy wonk like myself, or focus on addressing a different set of issues. Today, we're all housers. So first, why is the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, which is part of the nation's central bank, speaking about the intersectionality between housing, equity, environment, and community? Most folks think of the Fed as the institution that sets monetary policy, and that's true. But our community development and regional outreach team conducts rigorous research on the challenges faced by low and moderate income communities across the region, related to areas as diverse as workforce development, affordable housing, transportation, just for a few examples. And it's not just research for research's sake. We engage in extensive community outreach to help leaders in our district, which includes all of Delaware, Southern New Jersey, and Central and Eastern Pennsylvania, address the unique challenges and better understand local trends related to workforce and economic development, banking, credit, and capital, and housing and neighborhoods in their own communities. We believe that research should inform practice and that practice should inform research. And as everyone in this virtual room works to make the communities in which we live, work, play more equitable and resilient, the Philadelphia Fed seeks to be a resource and a partner for you. We want to help advance conversations such as the one we're having today by providing the evidence base for these important policy discussions. And we also want to work with you on future events, bringing together cross-sector leaders to increase financial and economic inclusion, regardless of residents' gender, race and ethnicity, or geography. So now on to our second question today. Why should you be concerned about housing? And to start, I want everyone participating in today's webinar just to take a moment and think about where you grew up. Think about the house or the apartment you lived in, the neighborhood or community it was part of. Maybe you're thinking about some of the communities we already heard about today from Arthur and Gloria's presentations. How did those places contribute to the person you are today? What aspects of the home affected your health, economic mobility, or other outcomes? If you feel comfortable doing so, you can put short answers in the chat, or you can just think about this privately. Keeping that same home and neighborhood in mind, I now want you to think about, what if it caused you to be sick? Maybe its condition caused you to have asthma, maybe lead paint stunted your development as a child. Think about, what if that home or neighborhood caused undue stress on you or your family? Maybe it was unaffordable, causing you to forego other essentials such as food, which was a trade-off that so many during the pandemic had to make. Think about if that home affected your education. Maybe it was an overcrowded living situation affecting your ability to study, something that so many had to confront in these remote learning environments. And think about if your neighborhood was prone to climate-related natural events. Maybe those natural events and disruptions affected your family's personal finances. How would those scenarios change your outcomes in life? Again, you can put your answers in the chat or contemplate this privately, but this thought experiment was meant to demonstrate one thing. Research continues to show again and again that housing is a platform for all life outcomes. Whether your work focuses on health, education, economic mobility, the environment, or another discipline, your work affects or is affected by housing. So for instance, for those focused on addressing environmental challenges, and that may be many of you on today's call, my colleagues at the Philadelphia Fed examined research related to climate change and consumer finance. Research reviewed in their paper shows that climate change appears to decrease home prices in coastal or disaster-struck areas, increase consumers' use of credit after natural disasters to smooth out economic shocks, and severely affect vulnerable consumers with low credit scores and low incomes. Additionally, we know that living close to a congested highway is associated with low birth weights and more premature births, according to researchers at other institutions. And we also know that living close to industrial plants is linked to low birth weights. Where you live and the unit you live in matters, and housing inequities contribute significantly to disparities in these life outcomes. However, these housing inequities aren't new or natural. As Arthur shared in his presentation, it's important for us to understand the past. And as Richard Rothstein in his book, The Color of Law, extensively documents in the US, or the United States history of de facto and de jure segregation, which are practices that were either private activities or explicit public policies, respectively, that impacted where people live primarily on the basis of race. Most commonly, people may discuss this in the context of redlining, but I also want to highlight racial covenants, which another colleague of mine at the Philadelphia Fed found to be prevalent in our city. Racial covenants were tools used by early 20th century developers, builders, and white homeowners to prevent African Americans from accessing parts of the residential real estate market. In Philadelphia, the covenanted properties formed an invisible barrier to less densely populated areas sought after by white residents and around predominantly white neighborhoods throughout the city. My comments here today are simply meant to scratch the surface of the importance of housing, as well as the challenges that influence where people live. And as we wrap up today's session and head on to the next two webinars that will continue this conversation around the intersectionality of housing and other topics, I hope that you'll keep three things in mind. First, whether you're a houser or not, housing is a platform for all of life's outcomes, and your work is either affected by the people's ability to be safely or stably housed, or it affects people's abilities to find housing stability. Second, many of the challenges that we must overcome to increase housing security of our neighbors, our constituents, or our clients are rooted in the past. It is essential that we not only develop new policies and programs with a disparities lens, but that we also address historical inequities to create a more equitable present and future. And third and finally, this is an unprecedented time to work on housing issues. With a renewed focus on this topic at every level of government, it's incumbent upon all of us, regardless of our sector, and in this moment of opportunity, to address housing challenges that reduce housing disparities for all residents. And the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia remains a committed partner for you in this work. I'd like to thank you all for the time today, and I look forward to working with you following this webinar. I believe we'll now open the program to any questions, so I will turn it back over to Erica.
Thank you so much, Jimmy. I really appreciate you kind of asking folks to consider how their living situations has affected them so that we can bring that knowledge and that sort of thinking with us when we're planning. We look forward to seeing your research as well. I'm going to turn it over to Roberto at this time with HUD to lead our Q&A session.
Thank you, Erica, and thank you to all our speakers. What a great set of presentations and really looking at the issue, but also the work that's being done to address it. So really exciting. I think one of the questions that wasn't answered yet, and I think it might be for Arthur, is what is passive survivability? Or if you can expand on that.
Sure. Passive survivability, I guess in general, is basically that it's kind of you're surviving, but you're not living. You're taking all the elements that are surrounded around you, but you're not growing. And so you're there, but you're kind of dwindling away. And so, we put a lot of focus on sustainability because that's so important. Sustainable means that you're not only existing, but you're also growing. You're also having those elements that feed into making a better quality of life.
Perfect, thank you. So this is a question. Well, first, thank you to Jamie and Amy, two folks who had comments, but talked about how they're doing work as well in building co-housing and working with the coalition. So really exciting. And I think that feeds into the next question, which I'll turn to Gloria. How important did you see it to have community input, right? To engage the community around your work, and then how has that contributed to the success?
I don't think that you can adequately serve a community without them being actively engaged with you, because otherwise you're not informed about what the true needs and what the goals are of the community, and where you can mirror those. Even with us, when we were thinking about things that needed to be taken care of, such as the flooding, but how important was that to the residents, and what other issues revolved around that? If we had not engaged the community, we would not be working on their housing issues right now. It would just be status quo. We would go in with the partnership of the city, do the restoration on the creek, and then leave the folks in a vulnerable situation. And so what the work with them has informed the work of the remainder of our project. It's imperative that it be community involved and community led whenever possible.
Thank you. And we have time for one last one before ending, being respectful of time. And that'll be to Jimmy. And really something you talked about was about how not a lot of people think of the Federal Reserve as a partner. Can you maybe talk about how non-traditional partners can be engaged, or how we should be looking outside of our current circle to look for other partners that could help us in this effort?
Absolutely. And Gloria, to your point, while we seek to serve the Delaware, Southern New Jersey, and the eastern 2/3 of Pennsylvania, we really never want to overstep when we come into communities. Our first step is always listening, and all our efforts are meant to complement and not supersede any efforts that are being driven locally. But to thinking about how to engage non-traditional partners, part of it's making the case to how can addressing housing needs benefit other sectors. So as I had mentioned in some of my remarks, thinking about how educational outcomes are touched by this, thinking about how health outcomes. We see a lot in the community development field about partnerships between healthcare systems, health insurers, and housing entities and local CDCs, and recognizing that by working together, they both achieve the outcomes that they're seeking, whether that be improved health for patients, reduced visits to doctors in the case of helping or working with a health insurance agency. But for a CDC, it's improving and strengthening the neighborhood in which they work in by working on the built environment. So thinking about where each sector is coming at this topic gives you the ability to tell the story of how, by simply repairing one roof or reducing blight or working on housing affordability, their work becomes easier, and the outcomes that they're seeking can be achieved.
Thank you. And I know we'll continue this conversation. We have another two for the next 2 Tuesdays, additional webinars. And so we're excited to have you participate. I will turn it back over to Erica to wrap up. Thank you.
Thanks so much. And thanks everyone for the questions. I just want to do one last thank you to our speakers today, Gloria, Arthur, and Jimmy. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise. And we're looking forward to continuing all of these discussions. Just one last admin reminder that you can register for our upcoming webinars in this series. Next week, we'll be taking a look at some local stories similar to what Arthur and Gloria have been doing, a little more local to our area in Philadelphia, Camden, and Delaware. And then in 2 weeks, we will have an opportunity for our federal agency partners to provide responses and see what resources they can help with and what resources they have available. And at any time, please feel free to contact me. We'll also be sending out some resources to all of you who registered for the webinar. So thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thank you, Erica.